Thank you so much for joining us. And where I'd love to start is the Vilomah Foundation. I am really curious about what the name means, and I'm wondering if you could share a bit of its story and also just kind of a general introduction.
Sure. And thanks for having me. I appreciate being here. So Vilomah is a Sanskrit word that means out of natural order. It's often used to describe a parent who's lost a child, because we have words for that, for orphan and widow, other losses in every language, but we don't have a word for someone who's lost a child. However, over the past 5 years, I've met so many people who've lost other loved ones unexpectedly or prematurely to a tragic or stigmatized death, like a sibling or a child who's lost a parent to overdose, those types of things. And I think that the word should really be used to include those individuals as well, because those deaths are certainly tragic and out of natural order as well. So that's where the name comes from, and we created it in response to the need for support for families who've experienced these stigmatized deaths. There's a general lack of support for bereaved families of overdose or other substance-related, or even gun violence, suicide. And I truly believe it's our call to action to help transform our society to one that's more compassionate and connected to ourselves, each other, and the earth, which is kind of aligns with the out of natural order theme. So that's where that comes from.
So much for that answer, and for the change that you're making in the world, helping people bring language to this thing that there isn't the words for. Something I'm really curious about in relation to that is your personal story has obviously been a kind of a huge drive to do this work, and then you're bringing together all of these people, you're talking to policymakers. So I'm really interested in how that's been for you, that kind of relationship between your kind of private personal processes and then the visibility that can come to some of them within the work that you're doing and the conversations that you have.
Sure. Well, obviously I didn't choose to do this work. This isn't anything I worked on prior to losing my son. After his death, the issue that haunted me the most, it was never, you didn't do this or you did this, or you weren't hard enough, you weren't soft enough. It was always I didn't listen to myself and my intuition, that I deferred to experts, or what we call experts. And those pings that you get in your chest when you're, wise self, God, whatever you want to call it, is trying to alert you of something. Those are the things that keep me up at night, that I didn't listen to that. So after he passed, I made a list of basically all of the intersections that could have prevented his death, and wanted to address each of them to ensure that this doesn't happen to other people. I literally thought it was going to be about 2 weeks. I would have the answers I needed, and I'd move on, go back to my job, and, that was it. Well, it's been 5 years, over 5 years now. And there's definitely some vulnerability involved with speaking truth to power, advocating for policy reform. But we do have power as parents, because we aren't afraid anymore. We aren't concerned about aligning with politically safe narratives. We're already living the most painful experience a human can experience every day. So we know what's important. Grief like this strips away conditioning and illusions. Advocacy becomes an extension of the love we have for our children. So I feel like I honor him with helping create a gentler path for others who are suffering like he did, that I didn't have an opportunity to do for him. So yeah, it's vulnerable, and it's a lot, but it's kind of beyond me.
The extent of the importance of speaking truth to power within the context of this is very, very palpable in your answer. you're coming at this with this lived experience that you're united with the other parents in, and presumably quite often talking to people who are wielding power but without having had this lived experience that they then need to interface with you over. And I'm wondering about stigmas that you come up against, and whether those have changed over time in the last 5 years.
I think that there has been some progress in reducing stigma, but it's definitely not disappeared. And more people recognize that substance use is morally neutral. This isn't a moral failure. And they have to really look at punishment and punitive measures that have not reduced or prevented substance use over the last 50 years. Harm reduction was gaining traction, but we're also forced right now in this country to look at how deeply stigma is rooted in racism and classism. It's not just punitive. In the US, many of our drug laws were built around the fear of marginalized communities, associating certain substances with Chinese immigrants, with Black Americans, Mexican laborers. Criminalization was never about public health. It was about social control. And that legacy really still shapes who gets treated, who gets punished. Right now, we're watching drug policy be conflated with anti-immigration rhetoric in this country. We have these ICE raids that are happening. They're propping grieving parents up to talk about fentanyl coming into our borders. They aren't related. There's a lot of, I call it grief predators, that are, using this fentanyl story to justify anti-immigration. They aren't related, and I think with this administration, it's very clear. When you really break everything down, a lot of this is rooted in racism. And it's hard to just not look at that anymore. I mean, even parents have to really say, what is it that is making it easier for me to face the truth of what my child went through and accept that they aren't different from those people who use drugs, and accept that we are all the same. So I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance there still. So yeah, I think it's been reduced, but we're in a time right now that's pretty scary and things are ramping back up.
Cognitive dissonance is a really interesting element of that to draw out, because it's always been my perception within engaging with these topics that the cognitive dissonance and the wrong-footed prejudiced beliefs actually keep creating the climate in which these things are able to keep happening. And so I'm wondering within that how your personal working definition of addiction differs from some of these kind of PR ops that are being done on what the idea of addiction is.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. We all use drugs in some form or another. I see it more as a coping mechanism. It's a way to deal with underlying disconnection, pain, isolation, unresolved trauma, or sometimes to intentionally disconnect. Really no different than a happy hour, having a drink on Fridays with your coworkers. In this country right now, it's much easier to access illicit substances than it is mental health care. So that's just a reality. Now, that being said, there's certainly a physiological component, especially with opioids, that once that dependence develops, the brain and body adapt in very real ways, and withdrawal can be overwhelming. It can drive continued use that causes problems within your life, but it's not because someone lacks the willpower. This is a nervous system trying to survive. It's much like being hungry or starving. Opioids can change pathways, stress regulation, reward circuitry. Over time, the brain's dopamine and motivation systems become altered. The substances shift definitely from something being voluntary and possibly recreational into something compulsive. And that becomes much more about desperation than just seeking relief. So I think that's where the addiction definition can come into play. But a lot of that, too, is driven by our punitive policies. People are often put in desperate situations because of shame and stigma. So yeah, I see substance use as a tool people often reach for in an increasingly disconnected society, and addiction is the complex intersection of the neuropsychologic or neurophysiologic changes and making stopping very difficult without medical intervention or medication.
That is a very pharmacological and very beautifully destigmatizing answer. Um, Something that I feel it quite well leads into actually is within the kind of the policy conceptualization of addiction, kind of many of the medical conceptualizations of it, when you bring in the idea that ibogaine might be helpful, which is obviously a pharmacological response in some ways to the issue, how does that land and what kind of attitudes to ibogaine do you encounter?
Very frustrating. One of the biggest challenges is the cultural understanding of addiction. It's still driven by fear, stigma, and the legacy of the drug war. Ibogaine is especially challenging because it sits outside of that framework, the familiar ones that we use that are so profitable, and they disrupt that profitability. Whether that's long-term opioid replacement medications or abstinence-based treatment models, both are very profitable, and ibogaine doesn't have that same appeal. Obviously there's safety concerns with ibogaine, but they're often distorted, I believe, and over-exaggerated. I mean, the risks are not too much unlike methadone as far as cardiotoxicity. And really, it was the same people that told us Oxycontin wasn't addictive that are telling us Ibogaine is dangerous. I mean, that's just the reality we have to look at. I know that when I sought Ibogaine for my son and I looked at the risks associated with it, it was not scary to me. Like, what he was doing was so much more dangerous than the potential risks of Ibogaine. We still, the most accessible treatment in this country is designed for alcohol use. It's a 30-day rehab. We're treating people with that model who we know it takes up to 18 months for your brain to reset its dopamine naturally. We're putting people in a 30-day rehab, and then when they return to use, we're blaming them. That's not okay. Changing that perception, I mean, it definitely requires you to look at science, honesty, and the willingness to evolve. What we're seeing right now, it's being driven mostly by veterans. And I remember being in a meeting where they were discussing its veteran suicide rate of 44 veterans per day. And I was like, well, we're losing 300 people a day to overdose. Why aren't we talking about that? And I was just basically told that wasn't an effective narrative to use. Well, that stayed with me because these are humans, and my son was one of them. And I refused to accept that hierarchy of human life value, who we see worthy of care and whose suffering we're going to ignore, because I do believe that that is at the root of this crisis, and I'll never stop fighting for all humans. But yeah, the advancements with Ibogaine are definitely could be contributed to the veteran community who's advocating for it. Sadly.
Yes, it definitely seems like the need to be respected and to be able to access healing is one of the things that draws all of these groups together. But to decide that there's one is more valid than another is a really, really awful thing. Something that I'm also curious about is obviously within the context in which you're talking about recovery and ibogaine, you're kind of bringing these issues to a lot of people whose ballpark will be kind of around harm reduction, addiction as it's experienced in the States, not necessarily engagement with things that are going on in Gabon, Iboga, ritualistic uses of psychedelics necessarily. And so I'm curious about kind of how those worlds meet for you. And then I also noticed that your organisation is part of the North Star Ethics Pledge, and I thought that might be a good jumping off point with which to start talking about this.
Sure. I mean, psychedelic medicine is growing quickly. Ibogaine carries deep cultural, spiritual, and historical weight with it. The North Star Pledge was a way for us to put in writing our beliefs and how important integrity, transparency, reciprocity, hate that word, and humility must guide our work. Much of it reflects what we were already doing, but making that commitment publicly seemed important to take the North Star Pledge because we do believe in all of the foundational values that it shows. As far as um, Iboga and Bwiti, this is difficult. These are very different cultures. And we've seen historically what Westerners are capable of when it comes to plant medicines. Look what we've done to tobacco, opium, cannabis at this point. We take something traditional and natural, industrialize it, alter it to a more potent and synthetic form, and often turn it into something that's more harmful than healing. I am committed to ensuring in any way I can to make sure that doesn't happen. Obviously, I alone can't control that, but that's something that we are committed to. Iboga has been used for centuries by the Bwiti community in Gabon, and any Western engagement must be done with humility, respect, and reciprocity. Now, that means not treating it just as another commodity or molecule, but recognizing the cultural lineage, protecting sustainability, and ensuring that communities who are stewarding it are not erased or exploited. It also means listening and building relationships that are ethical, long-term, and accountable. It requires honesty. Western medicine will likely never replicate the identical spiritual and communal framework of Gabon, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn from them and listen to them about the reverence, integration, responsibility, and living in community in relationship with the earth. That's something we definitely lack in our society. So I think teaching the values of Bwiti in conjunction with this medication or not medication, but are essential. And I think there's ways to do that. And I don't have those answers yet, but working with the right people and learning from them is a start for me.
That is a really, really beautiful answer. Thank you. And it makes me curious as well, because you're going to be speaking at the summit in June, what your kind of main feelings are about the issues that you'd like to discuss in this kind of international collaborative framework.
I mean, honestly, I'm more excited to learn and listen coming in there. I want to understand what responsible reciprocity looks like. I want to understand what interests they may have to learn from us. I think it's definitely more of a listening than talking for me. They're the experts when it comes to Iboga, and I'd like to learn more. I want to learn about, any interests they have in clinical research. I want to understand safety protocols, aftercare integration, and how to do this properly, how to make sure this is not just transactional and genuinely supportive on both sides. I feel like for them it must be somewhat scary and feel invasive. I don't know. I don't know any of those things, and I'm curious to learn when I get there.
Do you feel like you hate the word reciprocity because it's been overused as a kind of buzzword?
I do, and I don't like that it's almost automatically aligned with financial. Just paying people. I mean, that's something that we do in our culture where we think of reciprocity as just paying for something, and that's not always what it is. I think I see this more of a open dialogue about how we all as humans can do this right, where we're respecting our relationship with the earth, maybe even having contracts where those types of things are included, not just paying, because I don't think that they value money the way that we do here. But yeah, it's definitely overused.
Another thing that I'm curious about is in the tapestry of people that you're currently working with. So I've noticed an amazing list of collaborators like Jeremy Wheat, who I believe is the one who connected you with Ryan a few years ago, and then Juliana Maligan I noticed as well, who's hopefully also going to be speaking at the conference. And between them all, there's a lot of kind of adjacent realms of expertise like harm reduction, grief education, policing. So I'm wondering a little bit about the inroads Iboga and Iboga are making into some of those realms, and what that has felt like for you to perceive and be part of.
A lot of the work that I do is truly guided by, I say, my son. And I felt like he put me in situations, or I found myself in situations where I really wanted to know the experts in different areas. We need to come to this from different angles. It's not just one angle. We need to look at harm reduction. We need to look at public health. We need to look at policing. I think that, well, Juliana was the first person I met who I considered an expert in this area, and then she introduced me to Jeremy, and then I sought out academic researchers, Peter Hendricks, people like that. It was just important to me to find the most knowledgeable people in different areas and learn from them. And I feel like I've taken 5 years to really do that and really research on my own and find the right people to learn from. So yeah, I just think, we're building bridges across worlds here, across cultures, and it's important to understand every different aspect.
Thank you again. That's a really, really beautiful and holistic way of looking at this. And I'm also curious, kind of leading on from that, about your personal connection to Bwiti and what must have been quite a long and beautiful and intricate passageway from kind of discovering Iboga world, thinking it would be helpful for your son, and then kind of getting deeper into this world and kind of the stages that the shape of that relationship has taken. So yeah, I'd love to hear about kind of the expansion of your awareness from Iboga to Iboga and what's happened along the way.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like in some ways the effects of Iboga are not unlike the impact of profound grief. Excuse me. When you lose a child, you are leveled. Truth becomes front and center. Conditioning is stripped away, and you're able to see very clearly what matters and what doesn't, and truth. What struck me was not so much how I responded to Iboga, because like I said, I kind of had that understanding going into it, and Ryan can attest to this. After my first term, I basically slept for 3 days. And for context, I'm known for someone who doesn't sleep enough. I keep a very bad sleep schedule. And he said my reaction was very similar to those who come in for a stimulant detox who've been using stimulants. But my dear friend who was there, who is currently living with a daughter who's struggling with substance use, couldn't sleep at all. She was confronting all of these personal truths in a deeply intense way. I feel like I had to confront those things when my son passed. That shattered all the illusions, and I had to really look at control, responsibility, love, what ways I contributed to his death. Those are realities that just happen. That process for me was very violently initiated at his death. Whereas for her, who was someone who was still living in that, they were coming up and she had to address them. I felt the experience was very validating because like I said, I had, really had to come to truth and understanding in a different way. One of the most powerful parts of the experience was an interaction that I had with my son during the experience. It was deeply meaningful, but also not something I'm really ready to share publicly because it impacts other people in my family and kind of personal. But it was definitely very validating. It was beautiful, and overall, I think that learning about Bwiti and Iboga have deepened my sense of humility, reverence, and responsibility. And it's not just a medicine. This is a mirror and asks something of you about truth and honesty and how we live. And yeah, that's.
Thank you so much for sharing that answer. I'm wondering, I guess, also about the Vilomah Foundation as a whole. Is the kind of the thread of sharing this experience of this grief and wanting to do something different, is that kind of the main thread, but also parallel to a thread of kind of believing in Ibogaine as a potential treatment, or is Ibogaine as being a potential kind of treatment and kind of popularizing the idea of these experiences maybe being helpful, kind of somewhat separate within how your projects work?
I think that they will eventually cross over in different ways. Right now, excuse me, the urgency to help people who are struggling with addiction is at the forefront. But I also feel like this could be a very meaningful tool to help parents deal with their grief. Everybody's experiences are going to be different. I would never want to promise another parent that they would connect with their child in the way that I did. But the potential to do that is huge. And I work with a lot of mothers who struggle hard with their grief. We have a huge increase in substance use and alcoholism among grieving parents, and suicidality. It could be an extremely helpful tool for parents to address the grief that they're experiencing. So I do feel like that will become part of our mission at some point. Right now, it's very basic bereavement support and just building a community of parents. But yeah, thank you. That was a good question.
Thank you so much for answering all of these questions, and it's really, really amazing to hear about these things from the perspective that you're bringing to them. Maybe a shallower topic. From the depth of your engagement with everything that's going on and kind of the perception of addiction, Iboga, Iboga, how do you feel about current media discourse on these topics and social media chatter about these topics? And are there any outlets that are doing it well that we should be kind of turning our attention to? And how do you kind of feel about the language and the overall presentation in what you read?
That's a tough question. I don't think it's being talked about enough still. You don't hear about it enough. I'm involved in a lot of different support groups for parents and addiction education and things like that, and it's being talked about more. But I don't think that we have the right messenger, if that makes sense. I don't, there's a lot of stigmatized language. I was in one of the Facebook groups the other day, and they were talking about what about those destitute addicts and how are they going to access it? They're not even capable of making a decision. And it was just like, ew, why are we using such stigmatized language to talk about this population? So yeah, I think we need better messaging. And it needs to be based in cultural humility and science. That combination is important. But I don't think we're there yet.
I think you're totally, totally right that there needs to be a new vocabulary around so much of this stuff. Are there any other words in particular or terms that you would wipe or update?
There is a psychedelic exceptionalism component that is constantly something I feel like needs to be addressed. We put all of these medicines in a different category as their healing tools, but people need to understand that someone who's living unhoused and using fentanyl really has the same motivation. They are looking to heal in some ways. That stigma around illicit drug use should be as important as the way we look at these medicines.
Thank you so much. All of your answers have been really, really obliterating of so many preconceptions that are often associated with these topics, and it's been such a privilege and a pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much.
You too. You're welcome. I look forward to meeting you in person.
Me too. Thank you.
Sure.